Leonard Slatkin is here. He is the music director of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra and France's Orchestre National de Lyon. For 17 years, he served as the music director of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. In 1996, he took over as the head of the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington. He held that position for 12 years. He has been nominated for 60 Grammy Awards and has won 7. Here's a look at him and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra performing the finale from Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Now he has taken his experiences and put them into a book about conducting. It is called Conducting Business, Unveiling the Mystery Behind the Maestro. I am pleased to have Leonard Slatkin back at this table. Welcome.
Nice to be back. Thank you for having me.
Two things. One, we were talking about here at the table, so I will now share them with the audience. Number one is I was talking about Riccardo Muti, who was just here. And you told me this amazing story. And here's what interests me about it. You said that you were on your way to Chicago for some other reason, and that he had had some accident,
right,
and he had a performance schedule for that night.
Yes.
And they needed a conductor.
They needed a substitute, and they didn't have an assistant conductor.
Right.
So this was about 4 hours or so before the show. I was going to Chicago to judge a conducting competition. So I had to be there anyway. And my cell phone rings, and it's the artistic administrator, and she explains that Maestro Muti had fallen from the stage, much as Bernstein had done 20 years before. And everybody was frightened, and Muti was in the hospital. They didn't know what was wrong. And she said, out of curiosity, do you do the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony? And I said, sure, I do it. And she said, could you take the performance tonight? There would be no rehearsal, literally just come and conduct. Mm. I had my formal wear with me because I was headed off to L.A. to conduct anyhow. So I said, sure, I'll be happy to, and to give Maestro Muti my best, of course. So I arrived at the train station about 5, went to the hotel, got a quick shower, brought my outfit to the hall, and I decided that what I would do is go through the score and write out little notes for the orchestra to read. I do this here, I'm an 8 in this bar, this place I do probably slower than Maestro Muti or faster. So they knew roughly what I was going to try to accomplish, and it all went very well. And fortunately, as we know, Maestro Muti is just fine. I did see him in the hospital a few days later. We didn't know each other very well, but we became instant friends. We seemed to have a lot of rapport going on. It's not so often conductors see each other.
Yeah, what I was going to ask is, suppose it was a piece you'd never conducted. Is that unlikely?
I wouldn't do it at this point in my life. If I was younger, I might take the chance if I knew the work well, but hadn't conducted it.
Yeah, exactly, that's what I'm saying. If you didn't know the work, you wouldn't do it.
No.
Yeah.
But we've known occasions where conductors have just gone out and tried to side read, and it never works out.
It doesn't work, yeah. But this was a success.
This turned out to be a very nice set of performances, and I knew the orchestra very well. I conducted there many, many times in the 80s and 90s. So it was a good experience.
So another thing you're doing in your life is telling us what is unveiling the mystery behind the maestro, conducting business. It is a sense of we look at conductors and they seem like larger-than-life figures. They seem like stars. They seem that they're at the center of something magical happening, which is bringing 100 musicians together.
The book tries to do something that I don't think any other conductor has explored. Part of it's autobiographical. It had to be in order for me to be able to say how things are done. But it's also a book which is designed to let people know that so much goes into this than just the concert that they see. How do we get into it? What influences do we have? Does family play a role in all this? How do you study? How do we see our role as a music director? What does a music director do? Why is that different than a conductor? Being on the road, what's that about? How do we record? There are health issues. And in today's climate, a lot of labor issues that the conductor has to be aware of. It's a tough time now. So these are the things I try to explain, to say this is what the conductor's full job is.
It separates a good conductor and a great conductor.
I think it's the method of communication to the orchestra. The one thing you can't write about. That charisma, you want to call it that ability to communicate. Sometimes it's with the eyes, sometimes with the hand gesture, body language, sometimes even verbally. The great conductor is the one that puts all those elements together and makes everyone in the orchestra react as one. Can we really judge that if we're in the audience? You can only judge by what moves you. And if somehow you've had a performance which has been, in your opinion, just glorious, and you see people around you responding that way, chances are you may have heard a great performance. But if it's a blasé attitude, one where the audience goes, well, that was nice, could have been good, could have been bad. A great performance is only judged by how everyone feels about that particular performance. Was the audience in sync with the stage? Were the musicians all really working to play together? There are not that many great performances.
Who would be on most people's list of the 5 greatest conductors?
Certainly Bernstein.
Right.
Toscanini would be there. Furtwängler would be there.
Right.
And after that,
that's 3.
You can then go more or less into the speculation department in terms of who made the most impact.
Okay, let me Von Karajan?
I think for many people, yes. For some, no,
4.
because his repertoire, at least for the last 30 or 40 years, was somewhat limited. But he was a great conductor because he retained that quality of sound in all the orchestras he went to. Same thing could have been said about Ormandy, who, again, people question the interpretation, a little bit like they did Karajan, but to maintain the quality of the Philadelphia Orchestra like that for 40 years,
wow,
that's extraordinary. But for me, if I had to pick that one other person, I would have gone with Carlo Maria Giulini, who embodied music in his soul. Every time I went to a Giulini concert, I was taken to another place. Maybe it wasn't that way for everybody, but for me it certainly was. The other conductor, if you want to round out the 5, was, for me again, probably Fritz Reiner, who was the first conductor I ever heard who brought a true sense of clarity, excitement, with minimal gesture. He moved like this, and yet he was able to get this incredible sound.
What are you thinking when you mount the podium?
For rehearsal, I'm going over in my head what I had prepared in terms of how is this rehearsal going to go? What do I want to accomplish? First rehearsal is usually just to get through the music. Second and third rehearsals are to delve into the details. And the final rehearsal is to go through the works and think about how far you came from that first rehearsal. Then when you come to the performance, you throw all that out, a little bit like a football or baseball manager. You've designed your plays, you've set up how you want it to go, but in order for the game to unfold properly, you have to be able to improvise. So the conductor needs to adjust the tempos. Sometimes an acoustic in the hall will change because the audience is there, dries up the sound a little bit, and perhaps it means that some tempos have to go a little bit slower. Sometimes the hall will have a dry acoustic where the strings have to give a little more vibrato, give them a little more life to the notes. The conductor looks at the section and maybe goes like that, or sometimes like this, giving a signal to the orchestra. We need to do something a little bit different. But you can only do that when you get to the concert.
Gil Kaplan, who's been on this show, is it extraordinary that a man who is not a musician can take one piece of music from Mahler and perform it as a conductor with good orchestras and perform it well?
It is extraordinary. I was one of the first people to truly encourage Gil. And we met a couple of times before he conducted a note. I tried to give him some pointers. And he told me about conductors who had rejected and thought he would be foolish to do it. But I saw this passion, this willingness to risk all. I mean, standing in front of musicians who know everything, and with you knowing very little, that takes a lot of chutzpah, a lot of nerve to do that. And yet, his passion is the best word. It conveyed itself to everybody whenever he performed. And even though there may be technical shortcomings, he's always clear in what he wants, he hears what he wants, and he knows how to make a performance work. And I think it's an extraordinary story. What he did to encourage my favorite word in music, amateur, was wonderful. It is my favorite word.
What's the most interesting in terms of, what's the biggest mystery behind the maestro?
The one thing that you can't write about, and that's why does it work and why doesn't it work? I suppose for the most part, the audience doesn't think about it. Even the orchestras don't think about it. They know why it doesn't work, but they're never quite sure why it does. I can say that when I first went to Amsterdam with the great Concertgebouw Orchestra, it wasn't a great collaboration. Somehow, my way of rehearsing and performing didn't seem in sync with theirs. Mine was ultra efficient. Here is what you do here. Please play it this way. As I was taught by my parents, if something is good, you don't have to say anything about it, because it's assumed that's how it should be. And so my way of working is very, very direct. And not all orchestras like that. 20 years later, after my debut, I was invited back. And maybe I had changed, the orchestra certainly had changed, but we found ourselves on a very similar wavelength. And I wound up conducting them solidly for about 10 years in a row. You can't really know what it is, but I remember Eric Leinsdorf, the great conductor. He had a story that he told me once. I went to hear him do a performance of a Bruckner Symphony No. 7, I think. And I've never been a big Bruckner fan. But this performance was like astonishing to me. I was rapt from beginning to end. I went back and I said, Maestro, how did you do that? I've never felt anything about this music until you did it tonight. And he said, you're a lot older than when you first heard it. And our opinions change. Yeah,
that's a very interesting thing. It's like some people suggest that unless you're over 30, you shouldn't be reading certain great Russian novels.
But there's something to have encountered them at a young age and then return to them.
Yeah,
I do that with pieces of music. Something I did when I was in my 20s and I put aside. If I retake it now, maybe I will have a better impression of the work.
Take Beethoven's Fifth. Take the best recordings of it by 5 great conductors. Would each of them sound different to an ear that you have?
Yes. Now, not every performance is going to sound different, but I think the average listener...
Let's assume it's a great orchestra, but not the same necessarily.
Yeah. First of all, a great orchestra will have its own distinctive sonic personality. In the case of Toscanini, who we always point, you have his wonderful NBC Symphony in Studio 8H, a very dry acoustic. So you recognize that sound, and you recognize the individuals in the orchestra. You also hear what is a fairly straightforward performance. Not a lot of rubato, not a lot of freedom. It's more about the structure of the work. Then say you come to Karajan, who we've talked about. His orchestra, Berlin Philharmonic, is a much lusher sound, deeper and darker. And so his tempos tend to be a little bit slower to emphasize that sonic characteristic, and anybody can hear that. Then say you have David Zinman, who's done an incredible set of Beethoven symphonies with his orchestra in Zurich. But what he's done is to apply principles that have been discovered over the last 20, 25 years regarding how fast or slow, the kind of sound they made, and he applies it to the contemporary orchestra, and you hear that difference. You take, I don't know, Harnoncourt with authentic instruments, instruments from Beethoven's time. Automatically the sound changes. It's a different color altogether. The timpani is playing with wooden sticks instead of felt. The strings are playing on gut strings, catguts, not steel like we play today. That changes the sonori. So all the great performances of this music, or any music, what characterizes it is that it is different from anybody else's. Same thing if you hear a singer. If you hear Renee Fleming, nobody else is going to sound like that. If you hear Yo-Yo Ma, nobody else plays the cello like that. And down the line, the great performers are the ones, for me, that exhibit absolute individual artistic content in their presentation that's recognizable.
The book is called Conducting Business, Unveiling the Mystery Behind the Maestro, Leonard Slatkin. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Pleasure to see you.